Miami, Florida, is a city of sun-drenched beaches, luxury high-rises, and an electric nightlife. But behind the neon glow and the crashing waves, there exists another Miami. A grittier, less forgiving Miami. A place where the streets hum with desperation, where those struggling with addiction and homelessness fight to survive in the shadows of wealth. Between 1995 and 1996, darkness crept into this forgotten part of the city. Women were vanishing, only to be found later, beaten, burned, and discarded like trash in alleys, cemeteries, and abandoned lots. Their bodies bore the same brutal signature, a crushing blow to the head followed by fire. At first, police weren't sure what they were dealing with. Were these unrelated attacks? Drug-related violence, accidents? But when the bodies kept appearing, a horrifying realization set in. A predator was among them. A man who stalked his victims in the dead of night, lured them in, and left them charred beyond recognition. These women had names. They had families, histories, and dreams, lives that should never have ended the way they did. And though they had struggled, they did not deserve to become footnotes in Miami's crime history. They were not just victims. They were daughters, mothers, and friends. Their stories mattered. Each of the women who fell prey to this faceless killer had walked a difficult path. Addiction had tightened its grip on them, pulling them into dangerous situations. But before the streets, before the struggle, they had been so much more. At 42, Vida Hicks had seen both the highs and lows of life. Those who knew her said she had once been full of life, with a laugh that could lift the mood in any room. She had been a bright student in her younger years, passionate about music and poetry. But circumstances and addiction had led her to the streets, where every day was a battle for survival. Despite it all, she held on to hope. She told friends she wanted to turn things around, that one day she would break free from the life she had fallen into. Diane, known as Miss D by those around her, was 44. She was tough, sharp-tongued, and street-smart. Though life had been unkind to her, she still dreamed of something better. She spoke of leaving Miami, of getting out before it was too late. But life on the streets doesn't always allow for second chances. At 37, Cheryl still had dreams. She had once worked as a hairdresser, a job she loved before drugs took over. She had a son she adored, though she struggled with the shame of not being the mother she wanted to be. She still visited family when she could, but those visits became less frequent as her addiction deepened. Janice, also 37, had once been a promising dancer. She loved music, and before her life spiraled, she had performed on small stages, losing herself in the rhythm. She was a well-known face in her neighborhood, always stopping to chat and smiling despite her struggles. 4 women, each with their battles, but none of them deserved what was coming. It began with Vida Hicks. She was last seen near Miami's bustling produce market, a familiar place where many in the homeless community gathered. Hours later, her body was discovered. She had been burned so severely that the mesh pattern of her clothing had been seared into her skin. But it was the head trauma that told investigators the truth. This was no accident. Someone had beaten her before setting her on fire. Then, just 30 feet away, another discovery. Another burned body, another woman beaten beyond recognition. This time, it was Diane Helms. The Miami Homicide Unit scrambled. 2 victims, killed in the same way, were found in the same area. This was a pattern. Then, before detectives could even make sense of it, another body surfaced. Cheryl Ray was found in a cemetery, burned from the waist up. Again, the same brutal method. And then, the last victim. Janice Cox was discovered inside an abandoned gas station. Around her, ceiling tiles littered the floor. But there, in the dust and debris, a crucial clue. Footprints in transmission fluid. Someone had walked through the crime scene. Someone had left behind a trail. Miami detectives worked tirelessly, sifting through clues, chasing dead ends, desperate for a lead. The killer was targeting women in a specific area. He was brutal, methodical, and unrelenting. But who was he? And how could he be stopped before another woman lost her life? Then a break in the case. A woman named Yolanda, a prostitute, approached the police. She had barely escaped death a year earlier when a man, Spanish-speaking, aggressive, had attacked her. He had asked if she spoke Spanish. When she answered, he hit her over the head. She managed to flee and even filed a police report. Now she had seen him again, riding a bicycle. Detectives responded immediately. And there, on a Miami street, they found him. A man on a bicycle carrying a plastic bag. Inside, a juice bottle filled with gasoline. His name, Francisco del Junco. Francisco del Junco was a Cuban immigrant who had arrived in the U.S. during the 1980 Mariel boat lift. His past was riddled with mental illness. He suffered from hallucinations, paranoia, and delusions. He had been in and out of psychiatric care, but time and time again he was deemed not a threat to society. But now he was the prime suspect in a string of gruesome murders. During questioning, Del Junco's story took a bizarre turn. He spoke of Santeria, a religion practiced in the Caribbean. He claimed a Santeria priestess controlled his urges, making him ejaculate involuntarily. He believed black women were her followers, and that killing them would free him from her grip. At first, detectives weren't sure if this was a delusion or an excuse, but as they pressed him, something shifted. When one of them mentioned Santeria, Del Junco's demeanor changed. His voice lowered. His eyes darkened. "Can we go somewhere else to talk?" he asked. And that's when the confession began. Del Junco led investigators to the exact locations where he had left the bodies. He described each attack in chilling detail, how he had lured the women in, how he had struck them with a metal pipe, and how he had set their bodies on fire. The details were horrifying, but they were also undeniable. He was their killer. In May 2003, Francisco del Junco stood trial for 4 counts of first-degree murder. His defense? Insanity. But under Florida law, insanity requires that the defendant be unable to tell right from wrong. Del Junco had covered his tracks. He had tried to hide what he had done. He knew. After 6 weeks, the verdict came down. Guilty. He was sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences, ensuring that he would never again walk free. He was sent to the Union Correctional Institution, where he remains to this day. For the families, justice was bittersweet. Their daughters, mothers, and sisters were gone. But at least the man who had taken them would never harm another soul. And as Miami moved on, the fires of his crimes faded. The streets whispered his name no more. But for those who remember, the scars remain. Marlene Major was not just a name in an old case file. He was a mother, a daughter, and a woman with dreams, love, and a life that mattered. Before she became the subject of whispered suspicions and cold case investigations, she was a young woman full of life. She had a laugh that could light up a room, a kindness that drew people in, and a fierce love for her children. She was the kind of mother who took pride in the little things, packing lunches, tucking her children in at night, humming a tune as she folded laundry. To the outside world, she was just another wife and mother, but to those who truly knew her, she was so much more. But Marlene's life was not easy. She was married to Bill Major, a man who had a darkness inside him. He wasn't the kind of man who showed his rage in public, but behind closed doors, he was someone else entirely. The control, the cruelty, the suffocating grip he had over Marlene. It was a prison she couldn't escape. Still, she endured it. Not for herself, but for her children. Lalana Bramble, Marlene's daughter, was only 4 years old when her mother disappeared. At that age, she didn't fully understand what had happened. All she knew was that her mother had been there one day and was gone the next. And when she asked questions, her father gave her answers that didn't sit right, even to a child. She was a drug addict, he told her, an alcoholic, a prostitute. She didn't care about you, she ran off with another man. It was the kind of story that was meant to end conversations, not invite more questions. It was the kind of lie that Bill Major hoped his children would believe without hesitation. But as the years passed, Lalana began to see the cracks. Her father was not a man to be trusted. He was abusive, violent, and cold, and as she grew older, she began to suspect that the story he had told her was just that, a story. The truth, she feared, was far darker. Then, a year after Marlene disappeared, something was found in the woods. A skull fragment, stripped of its jaw and teeth, was discovered not far from the home Marlene had shared with Bill. It was impossible to tell who it had belonged to, and in the days before DNA testing, there was no way to confirm anything. The case, already cold, was left to collect dust. Years turned into decades. Bill Major continued on with his life, free and unbothered. He raised his children, fed them lies about their mother, and lived as though nothing had ever happened, but Lalana never forgot. She carried the weight of her mother's absence with her, and as she grew into adulthood, that weight became impossible to ignore. She confronted her father. "Just tell me what you did with her body," she said, "so we can bury her. I won't push for you to be prosecuted. I just want to know." But Bill Major only laughed. "If you think I'm going to tell you where your mother's body is," he said, "you're crazy." At that moment, Lalana knew. There was no longer room for doubt. Her father had killed her mother, and if he thought she would let it go, he was wrong. The investigation reopens. By the year 2000, Lalana had spent 2 decades living in the shadow of her mother's disappearance, but she refused to let it be forgotten. She walked into the Boone County Courthouse and demanded that someone listen to her. That someone was newly elected prosecutor, Linda Tally Smith. Smith had a reputation for closing cases that others had abandoned, and when she heard Lalana's story, she knew this was one of those cases that couldn't be ignored. First, they needed to prove that the skull found all those years ago belonged to Marlene. Special investigator Todd Kenner was called in, and using modern forensic techniques, he began the process of confirming what many had long suspected. A DNA test was conducted, comparing a sample from the skull to a sample from Lalana. The results were undeniable. The skull belonged to Marlene Major. Now, after 2 decades, Marlene was no longer just missing. She was confirmed dead. But how had she died? Forensic anthropologist Dr. Emily Craig examined the skull and made a chilling discovery. There was a gunshot wound to the head, with an exit wound at the top of the skull. This was no accident, no disappearance. This was murder. And there was more. There were deep cuts along the bone, signs of an attempt at decapitation. The marks were straight and deliberate, as if made by a thick-bladed weapon like an axe. And even more horrifying, there was clear evidence that someone had intentionally removed Marlene's jaw. The reason was clear. Her killer had wanted to prevent her from being identified. All signs pointed to Bill Major. But the investigators needed more. A killer's own words. Bill Major had been careful for years. In 1996, he had made a mistake. During a phone call with his own father, Jim Major, Bill had allegedly confessed. "I killed Marlene," he had said. But the call had not been recorded, and Jim Major's word alone wasn't enough to convict his son. So investigators decided to try again. In 2000, Jim Major agreed to let police record a conversation between him and Bill. It was a long shot, but they hoped Bill would slip up. And he did. On the recorded call, Jim asked his son one simple question. "Why won't you tell me where you buried Marlene?" There was a pause on the line. Finally, Bill spoke. "Yeah," he said, "and put me in jail for life." It was a confession. There was no denial, no outrage at the accusation, just a statement that if he told the truth, he would be locked away forever. It was all investigators needed. Bill Major was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Justice, at last. In court, the evidence was overwhelming. The skull, the DNA test, the confession, all of it pointed to one conclusion. Bill Major had murdered his wife, dismembered her body, and spent 2 decades living free. The jury took less than an hour to reach a verdict. Guilty. Bill Major was sentenced to life in prison in a Kentucky correctional facility. For some, the punishment was not enough. "If I could get my hands on him," one family member said, "I'd hang him myself." For Lalana, the conviction was a step toward healing. She had spent her entire life haunted by what had happened to her mother, but now, after years of pain and unanswered questions, she finally had some measure of peace. "I've always felt guilty," she admitted, "because in my mind she died trying to protect us from him." Now, at last, Marlene Major could rest, and the man who had taken her life would never walk free again. Marlene Major's story is one of heartbreak, injustice, and perseverance. For 20 years, her children lived with the pain of not knowing, the frustration of unanswered questions, and the agony of suspecting the one man who was supposed to protect them. But it is also a story of resilience, the relentless fight of a daughter who refused to let her mother's memory fade into the cold files of an unsolved case. Justice, though delayed, was finally served. Bill Major, once confident that he had committed the perfect crime, now spends the rest of his days behind bars, paying for the unspeakable horrors he inflicted upon his wife and children. But for victims of domestic violence, justice is not always guaranteed. Marlene's story is a tragic reminder that too many women suffer in silence, trapped in abusive relationships with no way out. Many don't get the chance to escape. Some, like Marlene, lose their lives at the hands of the very person who vowed to love them. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence, don't wait. There is help, there are resources, there are people ready to listen, support, and protect. In the US, you can call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-79-9-SAFE. If you are in immediate danger, call 911. No one should have to live in fear. No one should have to fight alone. Marlene Major's voice was silenced, but her story speaks for so many others. Let it serve as a call to action, to stand up, to speak out, and to ensure that justice is not something that comes decades too late.
In the quiet stretches of New Mexico, where the desert sprawls endlessly beneath a sky too wide for comfort, an old camper sat alone. It was weathered, sun-bleached, and simple, just like the man who lived inside. Bruce Stark had spent his later years here, embracing solitude, but never fully surrendering to isolation. He was 72 years old, a man with a past, a son, and a life that had gradually faded into the stillness of the land. Bruce wasn't a hermit, but he valued his space. His neighbors, Bob Nelson and Ken Hamill, understood that about him. They weren't the type to pry, but they made a habit of checking in just to make sure everything was as it should be. His son, Johnny Ray, and his ex-wife still kept track of the things that mattered, especially the things Bruce himself might overlook. But no matter how many people cared, no matter how many friends Bruce had, the truth was he lived alone. And one day, in the vast, empty quiet of New Mexico, that loneliness turned deadly. On the morning of September 11th, 1998, Bob Nelson stopped by Bruce's trailer, expecting to see his old friend. Maybe a wave through the window, a quick conversation about nothing in particular. But that morning, Bruce wasn't there. Something was off. Bob knocked, then pushed open the door. It wasn't locked, which was strange. Bruce always locked it. The inside of the camper looked wrong. His glasses were lying on the floor, broken. His wallet sat on top of the refrigerator, empty. little things, but they painted a picture, a disturbing one. Bob's stomach twisted. He stepped back outside, thinking, hoping maybe Bruce was just out somewhere. But his gut told him otherwise. He found Ken Hamill, explained what he'd seen, and together they went back to Bruce's place. If Bruce was here, they were going to find him. The land stretched out around them, dust swirling in the wind. It wasn't long before they noticed something strange. Beer cans scattered across the ground. Dozens of them. Bruce Stark didn't drink beer. Whoever had been here, it wasn't just Bruce. And then a knife out of its sheath lying in the dirt. A spotting scope, unfamiliar and abandoned. Signs of a struggle. Something had happened here. Something violent. And Bruce Stark was gone. Days passed. No sign of Bruce. His son, Johnny Ray, arrived, desperate for answers, but there were none to give. The desert was vast. People disappeared out here, but not Bruce. Not like this. Then Bob Nelson remembered something. A well just 200 feet from Bruce's camper. A strange thought, one he didn't want to consider. But it was there now, gnawing at him. Johnny Ray knew about the well, too. More than that, he knew something Bob didn't. The well was covered by a wooden box, locked with a padlock. At least, that's what anyone passing by would think. But Johnny knew better. The lock was just for show. The box could be removed. With a deep breath, they lifted the wooden casing away, revealing the darkness below. Bob peered in. At first, there was nothing but shadows. And then there was Bruce. His body lay at the bottom of the well, draped in rope. The autopsy would later confirm what was already clear. Bruce had been beaten before he was thrown in. But the most horrifying detail was this. He had been alive when he fell. He had lain there, broken and suffering, for hours, waiting for help that never came. The desert had swallowed the truth for 5 long days. But now it was time for answers. Bruce's family told police something crucial. He owned 5 guns, 3 rifles, 2 handguns, and now all of them were missing. His ex-wife had done something not many would think to do. She had recorded the serial numbers, every detail of those weapons, carefully documented. Those numbers were entered into the National Crime Information Center, NCIC, as stolen. If someone tried to sell them, law enforcement would know. But time passed. The case slowed. Days turned to months, then years. No guns turned up. No suspects emerged. Bruce Stark's name slipped into the cold case files, another unsolved murder lost in the records of New Mexico law enforcement. And then, in November 2001, 3 years later, something finally broke. A pawn shop in Albuquerque logged a transaction. Among the many items exchanged for cash, there was a .357 Ruger handgun. The gun was tested, traced, and then it happened. The serial number matched Bruce Stark's missing gun. Detectives followed the paper trail, leading them straight to a man named Edward Sedler. He had pawned the gun just 2 days after Bruce's murder. It was the first real lead in years. And when detectives ran Sedler's background, they found even more. A criminal history, drug charges, and a missing vehicle linked to a second man, Philip Lopez. The pieces were falling into place. On December 17, 2001, detectives confronted Edward Sedler. The moment he sat down, they knew. He wasn't innocent. He wasn't even trying to pretend. According to Sedler, he and Philip Lopez had spent the night drinking with Bruce. Things got out of hand. At some point, Lopez grabbed a gun and started beating Bruce. But Lopez told a different story. He wasn't the killer, Sedler was. 2 men, 1 dead body, and 2 versions of the same night. But one thing was clear. Both of them were guilty. 6 months later, Edward Sedler stood before a judge. He didn't fight. He pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 40 years in prison. Philip Lopez took a different route. He went to trial, hoping for a chance. But on March 5, 2001, the jury had no sympathy. He was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. For Bruce Stark's family, it had been a long, cruel wait, but justice had come, even if it was delayed. For Settler and Lopez, there was no escape now. Their freedom ended where Bruce's life had. Bob Nelson never forgot that day at the well. The regret never left him. He wished he had seen the signs earlier, that he had done something before it was too late. Ken Hamill reflected on Bruce's life, thinking about how he had more friends than he probably ever realized. He had been a man who just wanted to be somebody, and in the end, he was. Bruce Stark's death was a tragedy, but it was no longer a mystery, no longer a cold case. The men who had stolen his life were behind bars, and the truth, though painful, was finally known. Even in the vast emptiness of the New Mexico desert, justice had found its way home. Bruce Stark's story is one of senseless violence, of a man who lived quietly but whose death echoed loudly. For years, his murder remained buried in the cold case files. His name just another statistic in an endless backlog of unsolved crimes. But justice, though delayed, was not denied. Through persistence, forensic evidence, and a single-pawned gun, the killers were caught, convicted, and sentenced. Yet Bruce's case is not unique. Across the country, thousands of cold cases remain unsolved, families left in limbo, waiting for answers, for justice, for closure. Every missing piece, every overlooked detail could be the key to solving a case like Bruce's. And sometimes it takes just one person to come forward, one tip, one moment of courage to bring the truth to light. If you have any information about an unsolved case, if you know something, say something. Report it, share it. Help bring justice to those who can no longer speak for themselves, because no one deserves to be forgotten. Not Bruce Stark, not anyone. Justice may take time, but it should never come too late.